Okay, we've got the broadcast started yesterday. We ran it short on time, and we had in session one only able to cover topics 1 and 2. Topics 1 and 2 were getting your license, and also, let's see, what was it as well? Your new general bans. So we talked a little bit about that. We were kind of hoping to get to the FCC rules, but we'll do that tonight. We'll cover the FCC rules. There's only 36 slides for this, and we'll also in the next topic 4 will be a VE, and we'll move along from there. We'll try to get in voice operation tonight as well. So we'll breeze along, and this really isn't very difficult. None of this really. I'm going to go ahead and mute your mic, Cohen. There you go. So there really isn't a whole lot to the FCC rules except for a lot of common sense and stuff that you covered before, that we covered in the technician course as well. So we'll move right along, and we'll get kind of started with this as well. So the FCC rules. So whenever you let a guest ham operate in your shack there, you should really keep a station log. Write down the details of who the operator was that was in your ham shack. And this way, if the FCC should ask who was the control operator or who the third party was during a transmission on a given date and time, you'll be able to look it up and have solid information about what went on over the airwaves. And if you've had time to look, do you guys have a logbook at all? No? Okay. That's fine. Even if you have a piece of paper, generally what's there, and if you look in the book, I think it kind of gives you an idea of what the logbook, some of the information they ask for you on the logbook. Where am I here? The general bans. Let's see. Should have a picture of it here. And I'm kind of thumbing through the book here real quick just to see if I can find it. Yeah, there's a picture of it there. What I'll do, let me slip over here real quick and grab my logbook, and I'll put it on the camera. All right. Let's see here. This might be a little bit light. Let me stop sharing here and see if I can get this up here. All right, what we have, well, let's start from the left side here. You have the date, and then you have the frequency that you used and the mode that you were using. And generally speaking, your mode's going to be whatever mode is for the band. It's either going to be upper side band or lower side band if you're using voice, or possibly, if you get into CW, you could be using that. Approximately how much power you were using, the time you were on, the station you were talking to, whether you sent and received a report of it's a signal report of signal strength and readability. Basically, we covered that in the tech class. And the time you logged off. And then over in the comments, you might put something there that, oh, my friend Mike was in my shack, and, we were talking about umbrellas or, farming or something like that. And so then you have that information available to you. If there was some question, if maybe somebody was listening in and they were hearing something that maybe was questionable to the FCC rules, and the FCC might come, hey, you were doing this, somebody reported this, blah, blah, blah. Not that happens very often. It doesn't really. And if you don't really have to worry about it as long as you're within the parameters of your license class, within the same the part of the frequency band that you're allowed to operate in, and things of that nature. So it's not really a real big deal, but it's a good idea still to have a logbook. And let me go back and share this. There we go. And welcome to Rich this evening. Good to hear you, Rich. I did send the link out to session 1, so at your leisure, you can take a look at that. I'm going to mute your mic though, Rich, and hope that you can hear me and see everything. Give me a thumbs up if you can see everything okay. Good deal. Thank you, Rich. All
Yep.
right. Glad to have you on board. All right. Feel free to ask questions. I'm going to put the chat in here. Okay, there we go. I got my chat up. So hopefully I'll be able to pay attention to it if you ask a question. So again, like I said, the FCC doesn't require a log these days. Used to, you had the rules were a lot more stringent back in the earlier days, like 50s, 60s, 70s, things like that. So they relaxed a lot of the rules. It's just still a good practice, and it's a good thing to do. Is just to have a logbook. Okay, to keep accurate records of transmissions from the station, a record you record all these details and sometimes more in the station's logbook. If you need to also use extra paper, maybe there was something particular about uh, a particular QSO or something, you might notate that, look in the notes section and date that note section and reference it back to the particular line in the logbook. So, if operating mobile, and they do make mobile logbooks, by the way. In this case, Gordo includes his latitude and longitude while operating mobile. And so all of these details will help him respond accurately to any QSL card he receives. That's another thing about the logbook, that if you want to collect QSL cards and exchange QSL cards, send one to the station you made contact with, and you receive one back. Some of that stuff's done electronically this day through QRZ.com and Logbook of the World, a few other places. But if you want a paper copy of the QSL card, it also helps you track the information. You might receive that QSL card from a station, and you're not sure if you actually worked them. And sometimes these QSL cards can take, weeks and up to months, and maybe even a year or so before you actually receive a QSL card from that DX station that you talked with back in Europe back a year and a half ago. But at least when you receive that QSL card, you can go back to your logbook and you can compare it and say, "Oh yeah, I did work that guy, and all the information in here is correct. It was on this frequency, and it was at this time and on this date." So that's another reason to have a logbook. The amateur auxiliary is made up of volunteer hams who are formally enlisted to monitor the airwaves for rule violations and who report violations to their local official observer coordinator to take action. Again, this is all part of that, logbook and keeping that information handy. So if say for instance you've got somebody in your shack who's really not a ham radio operator. Uh, but you're there and you're operating, you've notated the information, you've notated the name of the person that was in your shack and operating with you, and all the information about what frequency and time you were on. Somebody may have reported, well, that person wasn't a licensed ham, and the ham wasn't available, the control operator wasn't available. If you notate that information and have it available for the FCC, it doesn't happen often, like I say. You have to be really blatant with violations for really anyone to report anything. So the benchmark of the amateur service is self-regulation and compliance as far as the rules are concerned. So really, that's one of the hallmarks of amateur radio, at least for those who value their license. Now, you're going to find people on certain frequencies. There are groups of hams that sound like, truckers going down the road using foul language and cussing and everything on channel 19. And you might hear that on the ham bands. And sometimes you'll hear also fellow ham radio operators actually just kind of skirting on the very edge of the rules. They identify They don't really use real bad language. They might say the word damn or the S word or something. They don't typically use the F word all that much, but you might hear that once in a while. And it's really sad that they do that because kids are on the band too. You have young kids, even as young as 5 and 6, who are listening in as well. And but they really just get um, right on the edge, and it's hard for the FCC to actually make a fine out of it. They have to be really, really way off. But at any rate, so Um, and in this particular advisory, this official observer has noted another thing. It's not necessarily a violation, but there was AC hum on the transmit signal. So uh, they send a little note to you directly without involving the FCC, and they make a suggestion like turn the battery charger off, feeding your 12-volt DC automobile battery. There might if there's something like that. So they also do things like that. They're helpful in a technical way as well. So there you go. We'll move right along. Homing in on a signal requires techniques in using attenuators, directional antennas, and other specialized direction finding equipment. You can fox hunt, we call them fox hunts, or even sometimes rabbit hunts, with almost any simple transceiver. I did a lot of this when earlier days of my ham radio hobby. Um, is you get a hidden transmitter somewhere and they transmit just for brief periods of time. And this is totally legal. There's nothing wrong with it. It's part of the advancing the technology and advancing the radio art and ham radio. So it's not something that is against the FCC rules, but actually honing your direction finding skills, and you try to locate that hidden transmitter. And there have been a few instances in which um, public service organizations like police and fire have had people interfering with their communications, and especially using those little cheap Chinese Baofeng radios that are available these days. They can transmit on just about any frequency. So, what I think it was down in Alabama or someplace down in there. Not real sure. Maybe it was. Um, oh, anyway, it was down in one of the southern states. Uh, the local police department had to call on one of the local radio clubs to help them find the hidden transmitter, the person that was interfering, and they were successful, by the way. But it took a little while to do because the person wouldn't transmit all the time. But this is a fun activity you really get involved in, and I wish the club would get involved into a little bit of fox hunting too. But doesn't seem to happen. Maybe we'll do it this year. Who knows? We'll put something together and we'll go out and hunt hidden transmitters. All right. When hams come up with a new radio signaling technique, it might not be specified in the FCC rules, as long as this new signaling technique conforms to good engineering and good amateur practice. You can begin operating even though the rules may not specifically authorize this new particular type of radio emission. So, we have those digital transmissions these days, JT8, and a few others that have kind of been up and coming. I mean, they're all part of the digital communications that are allocated to the bands, and it's all part of advancing the radio art again. And so there's no specific FCC rule about it. If it does become a little bit more prolific and popular and everything, the FCC might write something about, maybe you need to cut back transmissions, or you need to do this or need to do that. But by and large, since amateur radio is a self-regulating, pretty much a self-policing hobby, the FCC really doesn't get a whole lot of activity into into messing around with the hams too much. And again, they're short staffed and they can't do everything. You have to really, really break the rules to really get them involved and become a real nuisance. But they will get involved if a ham does become a nuisance at something. So at any rate, there you go. So only the FCC can decide what meets good engineering and good amateur practice. If, say, this new signaling technique has been causing problems on a particular band, maybe there's something, not necessarily with the mode of communication itself, but the application of the mode might cause the radio to do something like maybe send out a spurious signal. You want to transmit on, say, 21250, and it's not only transmitting on 21250, but it's also transmitting on 21150. So, that's causing some interference in a different location on the band. And that does not meet good engineering and good amateur practice. It's a good idea to find out why it's also doing that and causing a spurious transmission on an alternate frequency that you really don't want to transmit on. So before you transmit with your new general class privileges, ask yourself the following. Again, the reference to the Part 97 rules, 97.101A. Am I within my general class privileges? Yeah, you want to make sure that you're within the band operation frequencies for your class of license. Are you operating in accordance with the band plan? In other words, you're not transmitting voice over the CW portion that's reserved for CW or Morse code operation. Also, is anyone else using the frequency? You don't just turn on your radio and start calling CQ, CQ, CQ. It's a good idea that when you turn on your radio and you kind of listen across the bands, you kind of tune and everything, you find a quiet frequency, and you think you think it's not being used. That may not always be the case, because with HF, you may be in a dead zone for hearing the other side of the conversation, and there just may be a break from the person that you can hear, and the person that you cannot hear is still talking to that person, um, who. Hey Tom, how you doing? Mute your
Good.
mic, please. Good. Mute your mic, please. Thank you. So it may be that band conditions are such that you're going to hear only one side of the conversation. So it's always a good practice to get on and say, is this frequency in use? And if you do that, a couple times, maybe 3 times, I try to do it 3 times. Is this frequency in use? Give my call sign the second time and ask one more time, is this frequency in use? If no one comes back to you, then you can start calling CQ. Generally speaking, if you get on the first time, you say, is this frequency in use? Is in use. The person that's listening to the other station that you can't hear is going to come on and say, yeah, it is in use. And then you can move off and find another frequency, or you can sit there and listen and wait for the other person to come back. So just good operating practice. So the only music you will ever hear on the ham bands is limited to some of the audio feeds from the International Space Station retransmissions, where they sometimes wake up the crew with reveille or sing happy birthday to them in outer space. Other than that, no other music is allowed. It's kind of interesting that the NASA is using the ham bands to communicate with the space station, but the thing is that the International Space Station has a lot of ham radio operators up there, and they have station equipment and everything, and they do that as an educational aspect of the space station, in which um, some schools around the nation and maybe even in other countries will participate in talking with the space station as it goes overhead. And it's only for a short time. It's not on for a long period of time, but it's an educational thing that schools have ham equipment. Some do have ham equipment for the purpose of talking with the International Space Station. And although they do have their own frequencies, they use the ham bands quite regularly for certain things, such as playing Happy Birthday. All right, ham stations are allowed to transmit secure secret codes to control ham radio equipment located on satellites in space, except for this, except for control signals for satellites. And there's about 100 ham radio satellites in orbit right about now, I think. I don't know if all of them are actually active or in use, but they are up there. But the only time that secret codes are allowed to be used is in conjunction of using control signals to control a satellite that's orbiting around the Earth. So other than that, you're not allowed to use it. You're not allowed to encrypt your transmission in any way, except when it involves satellites. Common abbreviations, Q codes, and other phrases such as 73, QRZ, or please QSL that do not obscure the meaning of your communications are perfectly acceptable on the ham bands. They aren't really considered secret codes. 73 is something is just a designation that means best wishes. 88 is love and kisses. So if you might hear that once in a while between a husband and wife. Here you might hear 88. QRZ or QSL, and there is a list of Q codes. I think they're in the book. I'm not real sure. Um, I do know that I have the Q codes up on the Dropbox. If you need that link, let me know, and I'll send that link to you. Just drop me an email, and I'll send the link to the Dropbox to you. I think some of you already have it. So at any rate, they are not secret codes. They are commonly used codes in ham radio. All right, ham radio swap nets are a great way to look for or to sell used amateur radio equipment over the ham airwaves. This is legal. Now, the thing is, with the FCC rules, you cannot conduct commerce as a regular activity on the ham bands. You can't be the pizza shop down the road and you get on the ham bands and say, "Hey, we've got pepperoni pizzas on special today for $5. Come on down and get one." That is absolutely a big no-no. One of the things about the ham radio swap nets is that it all has to be really associated with ham radio, and you really should not discuss prices over the airwaves. If you're interested in something, you make arrangements to talk with the person directly to find out how much they're selling it for. It's really not a good idea to broadcast how much. You can just say, "Hey, I have this great Kenwood TS520S. It works. It's a great radio, and it's available if somebody wants a rig or something. Just drop me a note. Here's my email address, and we'll talk about price." So, at any rate, again, all equipment must be ham radio related. No selling your granddad's Model T. As a new general class operator, you can work hundreds of countries and become an expert in DX, plus learn a little bit of a foreign language. As long as neither their nor our administration has notified the ITU or the International Telecommunications Union that ham communications are forbidden, you're okay to work any ham in that foreign country. There's only two countries right now that have forbidden um, communications with other hams, and that's North Korea and some little obscure country. I can't remember the name of it. Maybe Tom Cooney knows the name of it. But it's good to have Tom here. He's a great wealth of knowledge, and get to know Tom if you can, if you don't know him already. But yeah, talking DX, most every communication I hear on the ham bands is in English. If, however, you know French or you know Spanish, you know German or any other language around the world, it's perfectly acceptable to QSO in that language. But the FCC rules require you to identify within those parameters in English. You have to identify in English here in the US, and you do it every 10 minutes during your QSO and at the end of your transmission. But other than that, you can talk in whatever language you want, but you have to ID in English. You're not allowed to let a third party talk over your equipment if they were previously licensed as a ham and their license has been revoked. Don't let them con you into letting them speak to your station. In other words, this person has done something that has caused the FCC to revoke their ham license. They are not allowed to be back on the air. It does not matter whether they're on your station or anybody else's station. They cannot legally transmit if their license has been revoked. And if it has been revoked, there is a process in which they can appeal to the FCC. to be able to get that rescinded and get licensed once again, but you're not allowed to let them talk. All right. During a third-party traffic exchange, only transmissions of a personal messages are allowed, and an emergency message relating to disaster relief are also allowed. So, in other words, if you're talking with somebody and a third party, well, let's say, for instance, you've got somebody in your shack and they're not a licensed ham, but neither have they had their license revoked. They've never been licensed. They're considered to be a third party in your shack. And say you're talking to um, uh, Guido over in Italy or something, and you've got your friend who's Italian as well, and maybe he even has family over there. And Italy is one of those where we have a third party agreement with. So if Guido happens to be next door to your friend's grandmother or something, you can get on there and say, "Hey, tell my grandma, I said hello." These are personal messages. That's it. You're not allowed to do anything else. Just little personal messages. There's no monetary thing or anything involved in that. In a disaster relief situation, um, uh, those are allowed as well, third party, if earthquakes and things like that. It's part of the relief efforts for foreign countries to recover while they're recovering from their disaster. It's perfectly acceptable to speak the language of the amateur operator you meet on the air. Just be sure to identify with your call sign in English every 10 minutes and when you sign off. We've already covered that. Okay. This question asks where third-party traffic is prohibited, except in an emergency where you are prohibited from passing international third-party traffic unless the United States has a third-party agreement in effect with that country. There is a list available that talks about that gives you a list of countries in which we have a third-party agreement with. To pass third-party traffic to a station in another country, the U.S. must have a third-party agreement with that country. Okay, let's beat this dead horse a little more. So with that, we have, let's see, Tom says there currently are no banned countries. However, North Korea and Yemen do not allow citizens to operate amateur radio stations. Exactly. Okay. Now we get into the question pool. Any questions before we get started with that? Good to go? Okay, here we go. Do, 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 do. All right. What is a reason why many amateurs keep a station log? Okay. And you kind of look at this, and the ITU doesn't really require a log of international contacts. Um, It doesn't require a log of all international third-party traffic. Um, while the log may provide evidence of operation, it's not needed to renew a license or any of that sort. So the only valid answer on this one is to help with a reply if the FCC requests the information. D is your answer. Okay, what information is traditionally contained in a station log? And I kind of showed you that a little bit, on that. So when you look at this, the date, time of contact, the band or frequency, the call station of the call sign of the station you contacted, any signal report. So really, all of these choices are correct. D is your answer. Amateur volunteers. Let's see. What is the amateur auxiliary to the FCC? Okay. The amateur auxiliary, now we kind of covered this a little bit. They kind of like monitor the airways. You look at the list of available answers here. Um, Amateur auxiliary does not conduct amateur licensing examinations. Um, they don't conduct frequency coordination for VHF repeaters. And while they may have their station for civil defense, it's not what their primary purpose is. The correct answer here is A. They are used to formally and monitor the airwaves for rule violations. And again, they will also, if there's a problem in your signal, they might drop you a little note that says, "Hey, you got a hum on your signal," or there's an oscillation or something. So, which of the following are objectives of the amateur auxiliary? Again, it's to encourage the only viable answer here is to encourage self-regulation and compliance with the rules by radio amateur operators. All those other selections are dumb. What skills learned during hidden transmitter hunts are of help to the amateur auxiliary? All right, we're talking about direction finding here, and using directional antennas to find a rogue transmitter somewhere. And so it really is the only answer logical here is B, direction finding used to locate stations violating FCC rules. You might even have a pirate station out there broadcasting on the ham bands, and maybe somewhere out in the woods, or a little shack somewhere. Who knows? Um, the skills for direction finding can help the amateur auxiliary. They've heard this out of this violation, and they don't know where it is, but direction finding can help find it. Okay. How does the FCC require an amateur station to be operated in all respects not covered by the Part 97 rules? Okay. Again, this kind of goes right back to the good engineering and good amateur practice. C is your answer right there. Okay, who or what determines good engineering and good amateur practice as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects not covered by the Part 97 rules? Okay, who determines or who or what determines? Again, it's the FCC. They determine what is good engineering and good amateur practice. And it's not necessarily a violation of FCC rules. It's just, you know, make sure you're operating well and politely. When choosing a transmitting frequency, what should you do to comply with good amateur practice? Um, Again, this is one of those situations. We listed it before. You want to make sure that the frequency and mode selected are within your license class, and you follow generally accepted band plans agreed by the amateur radio community. You monitor their frequency before transmitting, and so all of these are correct. D is your answer. Okay, when may music be transmitted by an amateur station? And again, this goes right back to NASA, and only D is the correct answer when it is incidental part of a manned spacecraft retransmission. So, when is an amateur station permitted to transmit secret codes? A little bit tricky here, and maybe not. Maybe not. Again, the secret codes you don't encrypt your signal or anything like that. But the only time you really use a secret code is when you want to control a space station. B is the correct answer here. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals of the amateur service? We're talking about a specific restrictions. Um, as long as Q codes are not the only thing that are permitted, and C is wrong because there are some things that can be used. So C is a wrong answer. We don't use 10 codes in the amateur band, but the longest answer here is B. They may be used if they do not obscure the meaning of the message. Q codes are they're international, and they're used a lot, so they don't really obscure any meaning, but they can be used. I, most hams really frown on using 10-4. All right. When may an amateur station transmit communications in which the licensee or control operator has a pecuniary or a monetary interest? Okay. Transmit communication in which the licensee or control operator has a monetary interest. Okay. Be again very careful with this because you really can't conduct business on the ham bands. So during those swap meets, you can let people know that you have a piece of apparatus for sale. And you look at answer B, C, and D, those do not apply at all. There is no monetary value less than 200 is a stupid um, answer to have on there. And when there's no other means of communication readily available, well, you know, that's not exactly true either. Your correct answer is A, when other amateurs are being notified of the sale of apparatus. Okay, when is it permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the FCC? Okay, again, this is all part of the International Telecommunications Agreement. The contact, your correct answer here is B, when the contact is with amateurs in any country except those whose administrations have notified the ITU that they object to such communications. So again, the only two restricted countries right now are Korea and Yemen. Which of the following would disqualify a third party from participating in stating a message over a ham radio? Ha, pretty easy here. A, when that party had a license and it was revoked and not reinstated. What types of messages for a third party in another country may be transmitted by an amateur station? Uh, Again, this is one of those you have to be very careful about. You know, I have to laugh at some of these. Um, a third party, basically, when you look at B, it says only messages for other licensed amateurs. Um, those aren't necessarily third party. A third party generally is a non-licensed person. Um, but in actuality, the proper answer here is C, only messages relating to amateur radio or remarks of personal character or messages relating to emergencies or disaster relief. What language must be used when identifying your station if you are using a language other than English and making a contact using phone emission? Again, it's very simple, English only. You have to identify in English. You can talk all day in whatever language you want to talk, as long as you identify within the proper time frames in English. So, with which foreign countries is third party traffic prohibited, except for messages directly involving emergencies or disaster relief communications? With which foreign countries is third party traffic prohibited? Okay, very easy here for this. Every foreign country, unless there is a third party agreement in effect with that country. In other words, it's every foreign country. Your third party traffic is prohibited unless there is a third party agreement in effect with that country. And there is a list of those countries available. Okay, which of the following is a requirement for a non-licensed person to communicate with a foreign amateur radio station from a station with an FCC granted license at which an FCC licensed control operator is present? So the requirement for a non-licensed person to communicate with a foreign station is simply the foreign amateur station must be in a country with which the United States has a third-party agreement. All right, and that brings us to the end of that particular part. Um, any questions anybody has? Let me get this. Okay, come on. All right. Oh, my, oh, I know what I did. I'm stalled here. There we go. I am stalled. There we go. Oh, goodness sakes. And we'll get set up for the next topic here. All right, very good. Anybody have any questions? Everybody good to go? We can go and talk about the next topic. You're pretty well grounded with the FCC rules. A lot of common sense there. Some of those questions might be a little tricky, so just be sure to go over them once again, follow in your book, and get a good idea of what's allowed as far as third-party communications are concerned with other countries. And just to kind of recap, um, all foreign countries are prohibited from third-party traffic except for those where the U.S. has a third-party agreement with them. And you can communicate directly with any country in the world, non-third party, directly, just you and another ham, except those two other countries, North Korea and Yemen. All right. You can be a VE as a general class licensee. You are allowed to assist with the administration of the exam for the tech class license, and that's it. But we're going to talk briefly. This is a very, very short presentation, 14 slides long. But if you upgrade, you can be a VE. So as a VE accredited general class operator, you and two other certified general class or higher operators could administer an Element 2 or the technician class examination. To take part in an examination session, you need to hold a minimum of an FCC General Class Amateur license, and you must be accredited by a Volunteer Examiner Coordinator, or VEC. We have the Laurel Amateur Radio Group, which is one VEC group. Also, you can be accredited by the ARRL. I am accredited by both of them, and I do hold an extra class license, so I can help administer the exams for all three license classes, Element 2, 3, and 4. So, and you have to have at least 3 accredited examiners to conduct an exam session. So perhaps you might want to consider becoming a VE. Okay, individual VEs are accredited by a VEC, or Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. The largest VECs are the American Radio Relay League, and also W5YI is also a VEC organization. That's Gordon West. That's who we have our lesson material from, and they are a VEC accreditation organization. I am not a I'm an instructor, uh, a registered instructor with Gordon West W5YI, but I'm not a VE under their auspices. Um, so I don't think I need any more than what I have anyhow right now. As a VE, accredited general class operator, you and 2 other accredited general class or higher volunteer examiners may administer Tech Class Element 2 FCC examinations. Very important to note on this, you may be a general class licensee, and the other 2 examiners may be extra class. You may be the only 3 examiners in the exam session. But because you are not an extra class, you're only allowed to administer the technician class Element 2 exam. If any of those tech class licensees, they pass their Element 2 exam and they want to try for the general class, they cannot do that unless you have at least three extra class licensees. You do not qualify to do the general class if that happens. Non-U.S. citizens may become volunteer examiners if they hold an FCC granted general class license or higher. Okay. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen. My wife is a Canadian citizen. She is a technician class licensee. And but if she were a general class, she could also become a VE, even though she's not a U.S. citizen. But she holds the proper class of license to do that and is familiar with all the aspects of ham radio as it relates to the FCC rules and regs. So there is no age limit to obtain a ham license. However, volunteer examiners must be at least 18 years old. And the youngest that I know of was about 5 years old when they got their ham license. And of course, that had to be a special circumstance, um, with the kid just kind of learning and being presented the information and then sitting down and then being asked the questions. He had to answer those questions all by himself, even though they were read by a volunteer examiner. There was no coaching, no coaxing or anything. All right, now we get into the question pool for being a volunteer examiner. So what license examinations may you administer when you are accredited VE holding a general class? Again, C, technician only. Very simple. Which of the following must a person have before they can be an administering VE for a tech class license examination? Again, they have to hold that FCC general class license or higher and have a VEC accreditation. Volunteer examiners are accredited by what organization? Okay. When you look at this, not by the FCC, not by the Universal Licensing System, not by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Again, the Volunteer Examiner Coordinator does the accreditation, the VEC. And ARRL, W5YI, and Laurel Radio Group are the three that I know of. So which of the following is a requirement for administering a tech class license examination? I mean, it's right there at the top of the list. You have to at least 3 general class or higher VEs to observe the examination and to administer. And that's just for the tech class. They cannot administer if all 3 of them are general class or even just one of them, they cannot administer the exam for a higher class license than tech. Which of the following criteria must be met for a non-U.S. citizen to be an accredited volunteer? Again, they have to be the holder of an FCC granted general class or above amateur radio license. And the minimum age to be a VE is, again, 18 years. Oops, come on now. 18 years of age. And that brings us to the end of that session. So, or topic, I should say. Any questions anybody has? Raise your hand. Anything? We're moving right along. We're doing pretty good here. We're just now at 8 o'clock. I think we can fit in the third one that we didn't get in last night, 57 slides. Let me get rid of this and open up my topic number 5. This has to do with voice operations. That is probably going to be, if not all of your communications as an HF operator, unless you really want to get into the digital and CW, most of your communications is probably going to be voice. Although I do have an old high school friend of mine from way back when who got his ham radio license, and he does nothing but digital communications. That's what he wanted to do. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. As I've stated before in in the previous course, the tech class license, when you get involved in amateur radio, there's something for just about everybody, some different aspect. And you're going to meet people from all walks of life, people with similar interests that you. You may be a beekeeper, you may be a woodworker, you may be a railroad employee, you may like boating or whatever. You are going to meet people on the air that share that same interest. And you may just want to do digital, you may want to do voice, CW, get into satellite communications. There's one ham that I know that does nothing but uh, communicate through satellites. He monitors the satellites orbiting the Earth. He knows when they're going to be above. He's got all the equipment, antennas, and everything, and that's what he does. He waits for that satellite to come overhead, and he'll work people, other hams, through the satellite. So there's all kinds of different facets and everything to it. Let me get over here. If you have any questions, raise your hand, send me a message or something. And I'm going to share and present to everyone this particular one. So again, we're going to get into voice operations, 57 slides. It should be fairly straightforward, fairly easy to understand. And we'll probably wrap it up tonight after that. Okay. Soon you will be a general class operator on the HF airwaves. Sometimes propagation allows you to hear only half of a conversation. I mentioned this earlier. That's why you need to make sure that the frequency is clear before you send out your QRL on CW or a CQ or whatever. Just simply ask, is the frequency in use? Hope you can hear me okay. I'm sitting a little far back from the microphone, but this is a shotgun mic, so it should be all right. Okay. One of the denigrating titles that you want to avoid is to be called a lid. I don't know what that really means, except that lids are people who are very poor amateur radio operators. So you really want to do more listening and figure out, how things flow on the airwaves, and then get in and talk. But don't be afraid to talk. All right. First, double check that you're following the band plan. Again, this is what we talked about in the FCC rules. You're within your privileges, and that you don't want to be operating outside those bands or those privileges. You don't want to be operating near the edge of the band as well. If you're on 20 meters, the top end of 20 meters is 14.350. You do not want to be transmitting on 14.350. You don't even want to be operating on 14 348. You want to be a little bit below that. Because remember, your sideband signal is about 2.8 to 3 kilohertz in bandwidth. So if you were operating, if you have your frequency set at 28 347, you're pretty much assured that you're not going to be transmitting outside that 21 350 upper limit. So you want to be well within the limitations of the band itself, and don't run the risk of transmitting outside. Okay, one of the things I always like to do is get involved in some of the high frequency nets. There's a lot of them out there. The old Buzzards net, that's just one of them. There's RV nets. There's nets, traffic nets. They handle traffic and things of that sort. Oops, somebody dropped out. Who dropped out here? Look like Rich. Need to return to work. Very good instructional program. Look forward to continuing later in the week. Okay, good. All right, Richard has got to go to work, so we'll catch up with him a little bit later. Yeah, there are a lot of good nets out there, and that's a good way to really get some good HF activity in. Is to tune into a net, listen to what they're saying, and don't just break in. Usually, the net control operator will take calls from certain stations, and then they'll open up taking calls from anyone. Most nets are open to all duly licensed amateur radio operators, but they do operate in a particular formality, um, and they will request certain types or certain ones to check in first, and you need to be respectful of that. So, at any rate, as we run down here, you want to be courteous. Wait for the net control operator to acknowledge you. Um, just note that no one has a priority access to frequency, so the only option is to conduct the net on a nearby clear frequency. So, as a new general class operator, be a courteous ham and always relinquish your frequency for a published or popular net. That's one of the things. If a lot of nets, the Maritime Mobile Net meets at 14,300, and they kind of pretty much go all day. So, if you get in there early in the morning and you're talking on 14.300, be mindful that there is a formal net that does operate on that frequency, and you might want to be courteous enough to kind of say, "Okay, I need to move off because this net's getting ready to come on. I'm going to move down another area." They don't have exclusive use of it, but it is a published net. People are used to being on that frequency, and that's what they expect. That's where they want to be. So be courteous enough to um, relinquish the frequency to a regularly scheduled net. So when you hear a QSO between two hams, the polite way to join is to simply say your call sign in between transmissions as one station turns it over to another station. You're just hearing a conversation. You've tuned into a band and you hear two guys and they're talking about something that's very near and dear to your heart. Could be woodworking or something, and you're really interested. You're fascinated. You're listening in on the conversation, but you also want to get active in there and kind of become part of the QSO. Uh, when there's a break in the transmission between the two, you can just get in there and say, "Hey, N3 LMS," and maybe they'll acknowledge you, maybe they won't. But just get in and say your call sign and making it sound like you wish to enter the conversation in a friendly way. So don't just blurt out your call sign. Sound pleasant as if asking permission to join in. N3 LMS, and hopefully they'll acknowledge you and invite you into the QSL. Okay, this term CQ is used by hams to fish for a new station to answer the call. You might consider CQ as being seek you, SEEKYOU. Um, we know that that's not what it is, but CQ is the general uh, use for calling any station. In other words, you want to talk to somebody and you're calling CQ and you hope that somebody will answer your call. So say your CQ and your call sign. I don't know why he puts it in here. Say it with a smile. Sound excited. Ooh, about making call to anyone hearing you. A drab, lifeless CQ is like fishing with old bait. So if you hear someone calling CQDX, however, keep this in mind. This means they are not looking for just anyone stateside contact, but rather they are looking for somebody outside the continental U.S., uh, particularly Europe or, South America, who knows. But they're looking for calls, DX calls outside the U.S. Don't get in there. If you hear somebody calling CQTX in Texas and you're here in Pennsylvania, you don't even bother answering him because he's not the person you're looking for. He's looking for a station over in Europe across the big pond. So, and they're usually very experienced operators. So it pays to listen and to kind of get a feel of how the pros are doing. This person may be looking to get that worked 100, the DX Century Club certificate. In other words, the DX Century Club would be you've worked 100 separate countries, and you get a little certificate for doing that. Ah, look at this. This DX station on the top of a hill will enjoy some great contacts. Boy, I tell you, I love being up here on the mountain paradise because I do have a very good place and I can work the world with a wire. And but I've worked the world, at lower elevations as well. And I always wanted to put up a nice big beam antenna up here, but I learned very quickly that the winters here on the mountain paradise are not all that friendly. When they can take out a simple aluminum vertical VHF, UHF antenna and turn it into itty bitty little pieces, the ice storms and the wind and the snow, I said, there's no way I'm going to try to put up a big, huge HF beam up here. I do have a 2-meter beam, 13 elements, and it seems to be faring quite well in the weather. But I went to a fiberglass vertical, and it seems to be working just fine. So no worries there. Okay, almost all HF transceivers have a split mode that allows you to listen in on one frequency and transmit on another. So you'll notice that your new modern transceiver will have VFO-A and VFO-B. On older equipment, like my TS520S, I have a remote VFO, which allows me to select the split operation manually by tuning to whether I want to transmit using the remote VFO and receive using the built-in VFO or vice versa. But when you set your radio to split, the split mode, you're receiving on one frequency and transmitting on another. Why do you want to do this? Because sometimes foreign DX stations they're not allowed to operate on frequencies that you are allowed to operate in your region here. They're limited and vice versa, because some DX stations, some foreign stations, like I think on 40 meters, for instance, they have a voice band in what is our CW band on 40 meters. So we're not going to get down there and talk direct with that station who's transmitting voice in the CW band, and you're not going to respond back on voice in the CW band, but rather they're also going to give you some information that they're going to be calling CQ stateside, and they'll give their call sign, and they may say listening 200 up or listening 50 up or whatever. They're giving you an indication that they're listening on the US voice portion of the band. So you need to listen on their voice portion on the one frequency and transmit on your legal frequency back to them on the frequency they're listening to. So they receive a frequency, and basically that's what the last half of this paragraph says. They're using the receive frequency they're using is within the authorized ham band for US stations. An example might be a foreign station transmitting on 14.145 while listening for US general class voice calls on 14.227. So we listen on 14.145, but transmit on a frequency they're listening to. So that's what split operation actually means. You do not transmit on the foreign station's frequency if they're operating outside your privileges. There's a rather modern looking transceiver. They have two built-in VFOs. My Kenwood 940 has two built-in VFOs. My ICOM 706 has two built-in VFOs. So I can work split mode with any one of my radios if I want to. So right out of the box. The dual VFO feature on modern transceivers with the same band receive allows you to listen to two different frequencies simultaneously when working split. With the right radio, you can even add a professional headset from Heil Sound. Plugging Mr. Heil here. That will put one frequency in your left ear and another in your right ear. That's how the Pro DXers work split. Yeah, all this stuff is a learning curve. Like I say, you're real learning. It's like I told you in the tech class for those who are in it. You may learn to get your license in these classes, but the real learning begins after you get licensed and you begin to get a feel of how a ham radio actually functions and all the different nuances and the different specialities are that make up the entire hobby. So it takes time. You can't expect to actually know everything, um, right then and there. Any rate, did I cover everything there? Yeah. Okay. On the worldwide general class ham bands, propagation will sometimes cause stations that you did not hear moments ago on the same frequency to all of a sudden come in right on top of your ongoing contact. Be a good ham, move your contact to another frequency if you can to avoid the interference. Yeah, that's one thing about propagation. You might have a clear frequency and you're just talking away and yapping and everything to your buddy, and all of a sudden you hear this other station. uh, the propagation just kind of shifts and you hear another station. Yeah, you can ask them to move, but the more polite way is to say, hey, I'm hearing a station coming in. Your buddy may not hear them at all, but you may be hearing them. I'm getting some QRM. Let's kind of move off, let's move to a different frequency and do that. That's good operating practice. When operating single sideband, your emission will take up approximately 3 kilohertz of bandwidth. Always stay at least 3 kilohertz away from any other station that is using an adjacent frequency. Kind of the same thing that I said earlier, that, don't operate too close to the band edges of your high frequency general class privileges. Always stay, at least 3 kilohertz away from those band edges, and if possible, 3 kilohertz away from any adjacent station that may be talking. That's a little difficult because sometimes the bands will get crowded, and especially as we enter into this next sunspot cycle, things may begin to pick up a little bit over the next few years, and you might find the bands to be a little bit more crowded than they are right now, and that's going to be very difficult. Um, Still try to be as congenial and as polite as possible, um, and just do the best you can. So on the 40-meter band, we would want to operate lower sideband and transmit at least 3 kilohertz above our band edge of 7.175, which means that your band edge, the lower end of your band edge is 7.175. The lowest you want to tune your radio is 7.178. That's 3 kilohertz up. So you don't want to go any lower than that. So this keeps all your signal within the frequency range of your general class privileges. 7.178 is in the 40-meter band where we usually operate lower sideband, which means our signal will extend down 3 kilohertz from 7.178. We would then occupy 7.175 to 7.178 megahertz with our signal. Now think about this. On the upper end, which is 7.300, I still don't recommend that you operate at 7.300, knowing that your lower sideband signal is going to be, transmitting on the lower end of that 7.277, I think is what it is, or 297 rather. And probably want to stay down at least a kilohertz from that upper end. If you set your radio to 7299, best if you do it 7298, your signal's still going to be below that 7298. I don't recommend being too close to the edge. either way, no matter what sideband mode you're using. So on the 20 meter band, upper sideband, stay at least 3 kilohertz below the top edge of the band. Don't transmit voice any higher than 14.347. We covered that before. On the 20 meter band, 14.347, a USB upper sideband signal will extend up 3 kilohertz. So it will occupy 14.347 to 14.350 megahertz. So you're tuned into Gordo's Net on 7250. He does have one, by the way, and about 3 kilohertz away is another conversation slightly bleeding over on your receiver. Not to worry. When the Gordo Net begins, simply adjust the IF shift control on your radio, and magically, the repositioning of the IF passband filter will help minimize the sounds of other stations just a few kilohertz away. Yeah, that's right. You do have an IF control that'll shift the IF slightly to minimize interference from an adjacent channel. My 940 has a different configuration. It does a similar thing, but I can actually shift it a little bit to minimize any interference. It actually narrows the pass band a little bit. Doesn't really shift it so much as it narrows the pass band a little bit more, so that I can reject signals that are just a couple kilohertz away quite effectively, by the way. So you may be able to shift the IF or narrow the bandwidth. Let's see. Many ham operators on worldwide frequencies enjoy operating QRP, the Q code for low power operation. QRP, there's a lot of people that operate QRP, meaning they're going to be operating maybe less than 10 watts for the most part. A lot of mountain toppers, that's what we call them, mountain toppers, will get out there with their portable radio equipment. They'll string up a buddy pole or a wire antenna on top of a mountain, hiking the Appalachian Trail or something. They got their QRP rig with them. They're operating 4 watts. And believe it or not, you can kick out one heck of a signal to work around the world with that little 4 watts. Given propagation and conditions being ideal enough to do that. So at any rate, you can look for QRP operations at specific spots on the band plan. Look that up, do a little Google search on QRP operations. It's quite fascinating. Sometimes I wish I had a QRP rig. Okay, most worldwide radios have a voice-operated relay circuit or a VOX. And if you have a big base station microphone, this is a neat hands-free circuit to minimize you having to reach over to depress the push-to-talk switch. Oh, I tell you, the humanity of having to push that button. Oh my goodness, it's just such a chore. George Jetson should be envious. Just be sure you never leave the Vox circuit on when you're not right at your turned on equipment. You leave your radio in Vox mode, all of a sudden the kids are running through the house and you're yelling at them, and the transmitter is keying up and hearing you broadcast over the HF band, "Stop running through the house." So, and believe it or not, I've done that, but that's been many years ago. So use a headset with an attached mic on a Vox, and this will keep you hands-free when you're talking on the worldwide bands. It's always the amateur radio operator's responsibility to prevent harmful interference to others. So if you're within a mile of an FCC monitoring station operating on a band where the amateur service is secondary or experimenting with spread spectrum emissions, you want to be sure that you're not causing harmful interference to the primary user of those bands. So you don't want the FCC knocking on your door. As far as all the choices for G1E04, all of those choices are correct, by the way. So if you decide to put up your own repeater, seek coordination, because a non-coordinated repeater has a primary responsibility to resolve interference to another repeater on the same frequency. That's why we have coordinators. Um, Generally, the frequency coordinator will look at the footprint of a repeater, what might be affected. They have a list that says, okay, there is another repeater on the same frequency within a certain distance. And so you may have to run reduced power. You may have to keep your antenna a little bit lower to make your footprint smaller. At any rate, you want to be coordinated. If you have a non-coordinated, if you just go out and you throw up a repeater and all of a sudden you're creating interference on the same frequency of another repeater, it is your responsibility to resolve that interference problem. And Tom can tell us a little bit about about one particular group that has a repeater on the air on 8.2, and they're not that far away. And boy, I tell you, I can hear them like gangbusters. I haven't heard them in a while, so I guess they've done something to kind of minimize the interference on 8.2. But boy, I tell you, when they come through like gangbusters sometimes, which means, and I don't think they're a coordinated repeater. All right, when you gain your new privileges on HF, the majority of voice communications are done as single sideband. This is going to be USB or LSB, upper or lower sideband. So the advantages of single sideband are that it occupies less spectrum than other transmission modes, making it possible for more people to operate on frequencies that are closer together, and is also power efficient, which can make your signal travel much longer on those sky waves. Sideband concentrates all of the energy that your transmitter produces. Instead of on a carrier, it concentrates it on that sideband modulated signal. There are some AMers, particularly on 160 meter band. You'll occasionally run across a few AMers that are running amplitude modulation. And that's okay. 160 is not very crowded. Sometimes you'll even hear them on 75 meters. But it's rare that you will ever hear an AM signal on, say, 40, 20, 15. Well, the AM signals you're going to hear on 40 are typically the broadcast stations, but you might occasionally hear an AM ham signal on occasion on 40 meters, but you rarely will hear them on, say, 20 or 15 or even 10. But at any rate, we're talking about single sideband here. All right, when we transmit single sideband, only a single sideband signal, approximately 2.8 kilohertz wide, is sent out over the air. The opposite sideband is suppressed. There is no carrier in a properly adjusted single sideband signal. This means your radio gets a complete rest during each break in your syllables, which saves power and is great for battery operation in the field. Since 17 and 12 meters are higher in frequency than 20 meters, we always use the upper sideband for 17 and 12 meters. That seems to be the breaking point right there. 20 meters, when you switch, as you go up, if you're using 160 or 80 meters or 40 meters, all communication typically is done on lower sideband. And then from there, going up, you use upper sideband. Mostly. So equipment limitations from long ago established the tradition of using upper sideband for frequencies above 20 meters and lower sideband for frequencies below the 20 meter band. Although equipment today has changed, the tradition remains. There's nothing really prohibiting you from operating, say, lower sideband on the 20 meter band or even 15 or 10. You certainly can do it. There's no FCC rule that says you cannot do that, but traditionally, and through what we have done, the way it's always been done is upper sideband. Okay, 14 megahertz is in the 20 meter band on 20, 17, 15, 12, and 10 meters, plus the 5 channels on the new 60 meter band, plus VHF and UHF weak signal operations. We use upper sideband. Anytime you're using sideband on any of those frequencies above 20 meters, even if you're working 2 meter sideband or even UHF sideband or 6 meter sideband, we typically use the upper sideband to communicate with. So by tradition and to easily make contacts, use upper sideband on your frequencies from 14 megahertz and higher, including 60 meters. Now, slow scan TV, it has a little thing here on slow scan TV. And I don't know exactly why they plugged it in here. But slow scan TV actually sends one line at a time, and it doesn't really use a whole lot of bandwidth. As a matter of fact, you're broadcasting it on the sideband signal. So if you're on 14.230, it says kilohertz. That should be 14.230 megahertz, I think, is one common slow scan TV watering hole. You can pick up, they just send pictures back and forth. I don't even know why that's there. Any rate, moving right along, when you upgrade to general class, we hope you'll continue to stay active on the VHF and UHF bands too. If you operate weak signal on VHF and UHF, use upper sideband for voice. I have used, been on, there's a group that on 144.205 on the 2 meter band, and that's upper sideband. And there's a guy that helps facilitate communications on that. You can get in on that activity if you so desire. So traditionally, again, on any frequency above 20 meters on voice operations, upper sideband is used. Oh, field day is not that far away. We're almost there. June, the last full weekend in June is field day. Okay, we use lower sideband on 160, 75, and 40 meters. And while it is not absolutely illegal to use lower sideband on 20 meters and above, good operating practice and procedure would always indicate that you should go with the flow and use the proper sideband. That's what I mentioned earlier. Hey, Tom, Scott is planning to be at field day this year, KC3 EQN. Let's see. Yeah, EQN.
Okay.
Scott. Yeah, Scott from the church.
Very good.
Yeah.
I think this year I'm not going to go down to Jeff's and I'll stay. So I'll probably be up.
Oh, good. We'd love to have you.
Can't stay away 2 years in a row.
Well, I hope not. All right. Very good. All right. Remember that the choice of upper and lower sideband is by gentleman's agreement, and you won't find much about it in the FCC rule book except on 60 meters. On the 160, 75, and 40 meter bands, amateur practice is to use lower sideband. Remember that as the answer on that question. Most modern amateur worldwide high-frequency equipment automatically selects upper sideband for those bands 20 meters and up, and lower sideband for the bands 40 meters and down. So there you go. That little chart down there, make a copy of it. Pin it on the shelf above your operating station. All right, now we get into the question pool. Anybody have any comments, questions, or anything else, any concerns they want to talk about before we get into the question pool? We are at 826, 20.26. Good to go. Here we go. All right. What is a practical way to avoid harmful interference on an apparently clear frequency before calling CQ on CW or phone? So again, You want to listen. You don't have to listen for 2 minutes. You don't have to send the letter V in Morse code. You don't have to send QSY. The only practical answer here is send a QRL on CW, followed by your call sign, or if you're using phone, ask if the frequency is in use, followed by your call sign. QRL, by the way, is on CW is just a short way of saying, is this frequency in use? Which of the following complies with good amateur practice when choosing a frequency on which to initiate a call? Okay. You checking to see if a channel is assigned to another station. Nobody's assigned a channel. Identify your station by transmitting your call sign. At least, nah, you don't do that. Following the voluntary band plan for the operating mode you intend to use is the correct answer here. C. So, which of the following is true? Mitch had to leave. Okay, I guess he had a call or something. Which of the following is true concerning access to frequencies in non-emergency situations? The only practical answer here is C, except during FCC declared emergencies, no one has priority access to frequencies. So that is what's true concerning access to frequencies in non-emergency situations. Which of the following is a recommended way to break into a contact when using phone? Okay. Very simple. You're listening in on that conversation, and like we said earlier, you want to get in there, and all you're really going to do is, in a very friendly with a smile way, is to say your call sign during a break between transmissions between the other stations. What does the expression CQDX usually indicate? Well, it is a general call, but it's not a general call for just any station. And it's not a caller listening for a station in Germany specifically. It's actually a caller looking for any station outside their own country. CQDX, CQDX. Uh, if it's a guy in Texas and you hear him, he's not looking for you here in Pennsylvania. He's looking for somebody across the big pond. All right. What is normally meant by operating a transceiver in split mode? Okay. Again, this was pretty easy to figure out. You're splitting the frequencies so that you're transmitting on one frequency and you're listening on another frequency. So it's just a matter of setting different transmit and receive frequencies. Which of the following is a common use for the dual VFO feature on a transceiver? Again, it's to permit monitoring of two different frequencies. Um, and It's part of that split operation mode. If propagation changes during your contact and you notice increasing interference from other activity on the same frequency, what should you do? Well, you don't want to cuss out the person on the other end. You don't want to report the interference to your local auxiliary coordinator. And you don't really tell them to change frequencies. You don't increase power to overcome the interference. The most common and courteous thing to do is to just say, hey, let's move to another frequency, and you and your party that you're talking with, you just move a little bit further away to a more clear frequency. So, what is the customary minimum frequency separation between single sideband signals under normal conditions? During peak high propagation times, it's a little difficult to keep that maintain that distance. But again, it's that 3 kilohertz distance that you want to try to keep, maintain. If you got somebody on 125, you don't want to be on 124 or 123. You kind of want to be on 122 or further away. How close to the lower edge of the 40-meter general class phone band should your displayed carrier frequency be when using 3 kilohertz wide lower sideband? So how close to the lower edge, now again, you're using lower sideband, how close to that lower edge of the 40-meter band for the general class privileges, how close do you really want to be to that lower end? When you look at that, the first one that comes to mind, you want to be at least 3 kilohertz above the edge of the segment. A is the correct answer here. What frequency range is occupied by a 3 kilohertz lower sideband signal when the displayed carrier frequency is set to 7.178 megahertz? All right, remember you're using lower sideband and you have your radio set to 7.178 megahertz. And the bandwidth of that signal, that lower sideband signal, is 3 kilohertz typically. So you want to subtract 7.178, 3 kilohertz from that. So your lower end is going to be 175 to 178. C is your correct answer. That's your 3 kilohertz width right there. So how close to the upper edge of the 20-meter general class band should your displayed carrier frequency be when using your 3 kilohertz wide upper sideband? Again, you don't want to get confused here because actually B is the correct answer. You want to be 3 kilohertz below the edge of the band. So the frequency range that is occupied by that 3 kilohertz USB signal with a displayed carrier frequency set to 14.347, knowing that the upper end of 20 meters for everyone is 14.350. The correct answer here is going to be B, 347 to 350. Which of the following is a use for the IF shift control on a receiver? The IF shift control can be your best friend, believe me. But if you have a station that is close by and is kind of you're hearing them a little bit, you can take instead of changing frequencies on your main dial, just use your IF shift control to shift the IF frequency a little bit away from that. You haven't really changed your transmit and receive frequency, but you've shifted the IF internally to kind of minimize the interference or to eliminate the interference from that adjacent station. So what is QRP operation? Pretty much simple. We covered this uh, quite nicely, I think. But QRP, again, is that low power transmit operation. Typically, it's less than 10 watts. You'll find a lot of people using 4 and 5 watt transmitters. So which of the following statements is true of Vox operation versus push to talk operation? You're with a push to talk, of course, you are manually pushing a button in order to transmit. But with Vox, you're using hands-free operation. It uses your voice to trigger the transmitter. And depending on how sensitive you have it set, there are controls to set the Vox control, latency, and how long it stays triggered after you stop speaking. You don't want it to, chatter on and off between words or anything. So you have a setting in there that kind of delays the release of the transmitter when you pause or have a moment between syllables and words and things. So, which of the following conditions require a licensed amateur radio operator to take specific steps to avoid harmful interference to other users or facilities? Okay. Again, when operating within 1 mile of an FCC monitoring station, when using a band where the amateur service is secondary, and when a station is transmitting spread spectrum emissions, all of these choices are correct. Um, you need to take specific steps to avoid harmful interference to those other users or facilities. Which of the following applies in the event of interference between a coordinated repeater and an uncoordinated repeater? Okay, again, if the licensee of the uncoordinated repeater is causing interference, they have the primary responsibility to resolve the interference. The coordinated repeater basically has priority in this instance, and they don't want to be interfered with. So, which mode of the voice communication is most commonly used on the HF amateur bands? Okay. Which mode of voice communication? Again, this is comprised of you're either using upper sideband or lower sideband. So, really, you're using single sideband. Either one of those is a single sideband of modulation for voice communications. Which of the following is an advantage when using single sideband as compared to other analog voice modes on the amateur bands? There's a lot of advantages to using sidebands. Most uh, noticeable is that it uses less bandwidth and it has also greater power efficiency. So when you have an AM modulated signal, you're broadcasting not only you're not only sending out a carrier wave, you're sending out two sidebands, an upper sideband and a lower sideband, and all the energy that's available from that from your radio goes into all three of those elements of an AM broadcast signal. If you remember back in the CB days, um, they advertised, with your single sideband radios, instead of having 40 channels, you suddenly have 120 channels. Well, that's not completely true. And also, instead of sending out 4 watts on AM, you're sending out 12 watts on sideband. Well, you're concentrating all that power into a single sideband. It's more efficient and everything like that. There's a few things that the manufacturers used to advertise CBs when the sideband came into use, and you really still only have 4 channels, but at any rate, less bandwidth and greater efficiency for power use. Which of the following statements is true of the single sideband voice mode? Okay, there's only one true statement here, and it is actually B. Only one sideband is transmitted, the other sideband and the carrier are suppressed. So all the energy that your radio is capable of is going into that sideband. So which mode is most commonly used for voice communications on the 17-meter and 12-meter bands? Again, this is all part of that, 20 meters and up thing. So you're using upper sideband for 12 and 17 meters. Most radios, again, will automatically switch to the proper sideband when you switch bands. Which sideband is most commonly used for voice communications on frequencies of 14 megahertz and higher? Well, we just covered that. Again, upper sideband. Simple stuff, very practical stuff. Which of the following is most commonly used for single sideband voice communications in the VHF and UHF bands? Again, we're above that 20 meter band. Again, we're using upper sideband even for VHF and UHF. So which of the following modes is most commonly used for voice communications on 160 meters, 75 meters, and 40-meter band? Again, by tradition and convention, we're using that lower sideband if it's frequencies below the 14 megahertz or 20-meter band. So why do most amateur stations use lower sideband on 160 meters, 75 and 40-meter band? Well, the current amateur practice, your answer here is D, is to use lower sideband on these frequency bands. It's by convention. Okay. So it's a tradition that's been held for many, many decades. And that, folks, ends our lesson and session for tonight. And I'm back again. So we're left with Tom and Cohen on here. And do you have any questions there, Cohen? Anything you want to add at all, Tom, as well?
I actually I have a couple
Okay.
questions. The first one is kind of, I think it kind of explained. Excuse me. The first one kind of explained itself. It was with the upper, you know, the frequencies being higher or lower than the other. When you hear 160, obviously that's higher than 20, but I guess it goes down in scale versus
No,
up in scale.
no. When you see 160 meter band is 1.8 megahertz to 2 megahertz, and it's a lower frequency than it may be it's a longer wavelength. And remember from the technician class, the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. So 160 meters is actually a lower frequency than the 20 meter band, which is at 14 megahertz.
Okay.
Again, yeah, go ahead.
Your 2 meter bands are like in the 400 some megahertz.
2 meter band is 144. Yeah, 144 to 148 megahertz. And again, higher in frequency, shorter the wavelength. So you compare the 2 meter band is like this, okay? Although it's in higher frequency, 144 to 148 megahertz, it may be higher in frequency, the bandwidth is shorter. Whereas 160 meters, the bandwidth is 160 meters long, or the wavelength is 160 meters long, but the frequency is lower. Okay, 1.8 megahertz to 2 megahertz. This is actually just right above the AM broadcast band on your broadcast radio.
So I guess when you see the differences that when you see meters versus actual megahertz, that see, I guess that's what I'm getting a little, where some of my confusion is coming from is because I see 160 and it's not a higher frequency. It's just
Right.
That's a higher number in the meters or the meter bands.
Yeah, it's a longer wavelength. When you talk about 160 meters, it's a longer wavelength, a lower frequency. Okay.
Okay,
Talk
so
about 2
that's
meters. Yeah, 2 meters is a shorter wavelength, but a higher frequency.
okay.
Okay. You know, it is a little confusing at first, and it may take a little time to kind of understand this. And even today, after I've been involved in it for 42 years and then some, you know, you tend to want to use things like, okay, well, I'm tired of talking on 20 meters. I'm going to go up to 160. Well, that's not right. You're going actually down to 160 meters because you're going lower in frequency.
Okay. I think that's my biggest problem is that I don't associate frequencies with the meters that it's displaying, and I think I need to work on that a lot more. So
Yeah, and remember that magic number that we had before, 300, okay? If you wanna know the wavelength of something or the approximate wavelength, you wanna divide frequency into 300 or divide 300 by frequency in megahertz. So, if you took, let's say, 145 or, 146 megahertz and divided it into 300, um, it's a little different. Actually, 150 divided into 300, 150 megahertz divided into 300 gives you the actual 2 meter band, because you're as far as the wavelength, 2 meter wavelength. So it's a little bit different. It's a little higher than 2 meters, but that's the closest you come to it. It's a little awkward to say, oh, yeah, I'm using the 2.35 meter band. We just call it the 2 meter band. So, and if you want to know the frequency um, of a wavelength, you take the wavelength and divide that into 300, and it kind of gives you the frequency that or approximate frequency that you're going to be that you want to know. So that 300 is very important.
yeah. So when you say like 2 meter band, 40 meter band, that's actually the wavelength, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So that's where that number's coming from. All right.
That is the wavelength. And that's how it's commonly referred to. We don't typically say, okay, we're going to go to the 144 megahertz band. We typically say we're going to, let's, use the 2 meter band, or we're going to use the 40 meter band. And we're actually going lower in frequency if we go to 40 meters from 2 meters.
Okay.
Wavelength might be longer, but you're going lower in frequency.
Okay. And now here's my other trick question. We mentioned before about using the my call sign is KC3NCL.
Okay.
Now, if I would move from Pennsylvania and I go down, like, say, go to do disaster relief in Florida or something. Now, I don't remember the
Okay.
number for Florida, but you would say your call sign, and you would say slash the number for Florida. Is that correct? KC3NCL slash.
Yeah, most of the time we don't have to do that. I mean, we don't do that really much anymore. But if you're in, say, you go to a different call area, and people know you're from 3 land or whatever, you say KC3 blah 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 slash W4 is the designation, and the reason you do that predominantly is sometimes propagation might catch people off guard. If all of a sudden, somebody in Florida hears a W3 call, or a 3 call from Pennsylvania, and, conditions could be such, and this has happened before, conditions could be such that they might not be sure that they're actually hearing a station locally, but they're actually hearing a station from Pennsylvania. Case in point is this. I was at the Outer Banks, which is in the 4 call area, and I had a 4 call back then anyway. And I was at the Outer Banks, and I was tuning around the 2 meter band, and all of a sudden I heard this repeater and people giving out 2 calls. They were in the 2 call area. Well, they weren't local to me. If they were local to me, they could indicate such as saying this is into blah 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 stroke W4. Stand by, I got a call. And if they did that, I would know that they were local, but they weren't local. Propagation just happened to be such on 2 meters in this particular instance that I was hearing guys talking on this 2 meter repeater up in New Jersey. So, but that's one reason you would probably want to use the designator at the end for the call area that you're in, to just to kind of indicate that you are local. And I'll do it once in a while. I don't do it all the time. If I'm traveling through Virginia or down, through the 4 call land, I might might just go ahead and give a mobile designation by saying this is N3 LMS mobile, and I could say mobile W4, and just to indicate that I am in 4 land and not some DX station, some propagation on 2 meters, because it does happen.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's not something you have to do all the time.
oh, okay. Okay. I didn't know if that was I don't know if that was a kind of a requirement if you were in another area to do that.
Nah, not really a requirement. It's just a courtesy, really, more than anything.
Okay.
I think at one time the FCC rules did designate that you needed to do that, but there's a lot of things they've relaxed over the years, so you don't have to. But one thing you do have to do, however, is as a tech class license, if when you pass your general class license, you can operate immediately before that upgrade actually shows in the FCC ULS database. You do have to give your call sign. If you're operating in the general class bands, your call sign /AG to indicate that you are legal to operate in that band.
So you would actually say /AG.
Yeah. Or stroke AG. Most people say stroke AG.
I didn't. Well, I was thinking the way the book presented it, it kind of sounded like you just give your call sign. Like, for instance, mine KC3NCL AG. I didn't know you had the.
Yeah, you
didn't know-
could. Yeah, you could do that too. It's just, you know, you have to say it no matter what if
Right.
you haven't shown up in the ULS database. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Anything else?
Oh, I'm sure there's something. Believe me.
All right. Hey, you can always drop me an email. It's fine, Wayne at n3lms.net and all that other good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast. Your questions are very good. I'm sure it might help somebody else out there who might be struggling with the same thing. Anyway, we're going to stop this broadcast for tonight, session 2, and I'll make the link to the YouTube session available tomorrow at some point. There will not be a class on Thursday night, by the way.